Working with positioning in CSS is something that drives most web designers a little bit crazy, insane, frustrated, mad, angry, hangry, and just all kinds of difficulty, because it does not always behave how you expect. It often behaves badly and can be extremely frustrating. So there's, beyond basic positioning layouts, there's a lot of detailed nuance that is hard to figure out until it happens in a way that you don't want. And then you have to do some research to figure out why it's doing that and how to overcome that, which usually involves some sort of hack or other unfortunate process that we'll have to do with the CSS to make it work. So positioning, much like floating, it's really awesome when it works, and it's super frustrating when it doesn't. So looking at the document that we have here, it has a paragraph, then it has a div which has class of outer, then there's this little extra div in here with the class of inner. A paragraph is inside that outer div, and then a bunch more paragraphs. Now the extra paragraphs at the end are to put enough page content on to allow us to scroll, because positioning doesn't really render itself visible until we change it from the default. When we have elements on screen, by default, their base position as set is going to be static. And what that means is the browser is going to render and position the elements on screen in the order that they show up in our markup. So we can see the first paragraph shows up. Then we have this div with outer, the inner div. The inner div is the blue square. If I go look at my CSS, I'll see it has a width and height set at 100 pixels. It has a background color set to blue. My outer div has a width and height of 400, background color set to red. And then after that, there's just these extra paragraphs. So that's the order they show up in my markup. That is the same order that they're showing up on screen. Let's set the position property of elements. The browser will assume their position is static. So they will render in the order they show up in the markup. Now, what's interesting is we can then start to change things a little bit, because if I were to set my position to relative for my inner blue box, well, also notice that it has a top and left property set on it. And in doing so, you'll notice that it moved. But the paragraph after it did not. So by giving an item a position property other than static, we can actually put it anywhere we want on screen. And this is where positioning actually becomes much more interesting. Because if we can move things around on screen, we can actually start to design our layouts and be more creative with what we see. Got a little problem going on here in that my blue box is now covering up the text. So from an actual layout standpoint, probably not the best idea. But we can. And that's what makes that kind of cool. Now you'll notice that it's positioning this object relative to the last positioned object, which happens to be our outer div, which has a position set to static. So that it, by default, it's assuming it needs to position itself in relation to its parent, which is now this red box. Now, we can also set it so that it sets its position where the top box, because its position is only static, it doesn't count for a positioning element. So now the blue box moved itself, but we can see the paragraph after it filled the gap. So one of the reasons this file has all of the position properties in here, and all are commented out except one at a time, is so that you can comment and uncomment different lines and try out different positioning combos to go, I wonder what happens when, and change the values to see. So this file is set up to be an experimental file for you to give you that opportunity to try things out. So now my outer box, because its position is relative instead of static, it too moved over 50. But if you notice, the blue box is now no longer indexing off of the top left corner of the document, but it's indexing off of its parent box, which is outer. But a funny thing happens that when we set positioning of objects and move them, it causes the objects that follow to then often disregard those objects, because that's how we get the text now appearing behind the blue box. The blue box moved, the text now, as far as that paragraph in the red box is concerned, this blue box doesn't exist, so it moved all the way up to the top left corner. Now if we go relative on both of them, we will see that now, because it's relative, it doesn't rip the document out of, or the object out of the document flow. So objects that come later still assume that that item is there. They're able to move on top of it so we can position things. And something else to keep in mind, we can also use negative numbers. So we're not bound to only using positive values. So we can actually shift things back up the document just by using a negative number, which is actually kind of fun. So we can create some very complex visual layouts by how we position the elements on screen. So we can move them around, we can adjust their positions so that they behave different. Key thing on relative is it doesn't remove the document or the element that's being positioned from the document flow, so the other elements then fill that gap. Instead, the other elements that follow as if nothing has changed. It just allows us to move that object in relation to the last relative positioned object. When we use absolute, everything on the page disavows the knowledge of that object that's now being positioned and pretends it doesn't exist, and they close the gap. So if I set the outer to absolute, we will see that all the paragraphs from below moved up the page to close the gap. So this becomes a little bit of mental geometry as you start playing with this, or gymnastics really. It's more mental gymnastics as you're like, wait, if I move this and do this, how does that? And the answer to, well, then how do you know which one to use when and where, is make a design. And then from that, start trying to figure out what needs to happen to make it show up on your page. Typically, when doing a page layout, we are going to, when we're not using CSS Grid, we will be using some version of float and positioning as a way to manipulate the placement of objects on screen. We will combine different methods together. It's not just we only use floats or we only use positioning, but we use some version of a little bit of each to ultimately achieve our end goal. As this has been positioned, when I scroll my page, we can see how my outer box is indeed scrolling up with it. So if I were to move the top down even a little bit further, when I scroll, we can see how it scrolls up the screen as the page scrolls. If we set an object's position to fixed, it doesn't move. Top and left are the two most common properties we use when we're setting position, because we generally are often designing in relation to the top left corner of the screen. But there will be times where you will want to, say, anchor something on the right margin or anchor something on the footer of the screen. So you have a permanent footer or a permanent header. Well, we can set that property. So instead of saying top, I could then instead say bottom and just set it to 0. And when I do that, it's now fixed to the bottom. And it doesn't matter how big or tall my screen is, it will be at the bottom. That may not work well with my design, but I can do it. Because fixing something at the bottom, your stuff is scrolling up. Often that's done for more decorative purposes, because having a permanent footer is often not useful. Having a permanent header is not uncommon, because then you can have branding and navigation permanently available on screen, no matter how much the user is scrolling through your page. On a desktop-sized screen, that's not so bad. On a mobile screen where you have limited real estate, that would usually be a bad practice to do. And that's why we have things like the hamburger menu, where you click a button, it shows you the navigation instead. Because on a mobile screen, you can't just have a little bar with a bunch of links, because our fingers are not small enough to push those little single word buttons that at that point on screen are about 2-point text. Right, one of the more recent positioning options available, it's not fully compatible in old browsers, but decent age browsers and all modern browsers it works, and that is a position property of sticky. Sticky is similar to fixed in that something will stay. Yeah, it should. Sticky, what happens is this object, I've set it top at 0, left at 50. So it's being positioned relative to its parent. So it sits at the top of the box here. And now what's really cool on sticky is it's going to stay when the top of that box hits the top of my screen. The blue box isn't going away. And it's not going away, it's not going away until the bottom of the box catches up to it. So until the bottom of its container catches. So it's possible to create a sense of, you put something on screen. Maybe you have your primary logo header across the top, a big banner. You have navigation below that. You start scrolling down your web page, the header disappears, now the navigation stays while we scroll through the rest of the page. Or the navigation stays while we scroll through a bunch of it, and then you say, well, if they've gone any lower than that, they don't need it anymore, and then you let it go away. So when that container hits, then it disappears. But it's a neat way of creating this interaction that we used to have to use JavaScript to pull that off. So that being able to lock things on screen like this through a certain amount of scrolling, we used to do that through JavaScript and create what was called a parallax website. So we create things that would scroll at different speeds across our screen, and it took using a JavaScript framework to pull that off. And the fact that I can do it by just setting a position property of an object to sticky is super awesome. The default is static. If you are going to start positioning things, normally we will usually be using relative. We will set the relative property of our objects and then we position. So this is now being positioned relative to its container. The blue box is being positioned relative to its container. Now the container for the red box is going to be the body element, because if I look in my markup from outer, the next thing that has default positioning on it is not the sibling, which has equal weight, but the parent of this div here is body. Because this paragraph, this div, which has our blue box and a paragraph, are siblings. All of these other paragraphs are siblings. So they are at the same hierarchy. So when it comes to positioning, when we say relative, we're saying relative to our parent object. But when we're using relative, it doesn't pull that element out of the document flow and then move it so that it goes over things if we're at 0, because it's at its default location. But if I were to now change this to a different number, then we can see how it pulled it out of the document flow, but nothing else repainted or changed its position on screen, because we're using relative. Absolute is now going to position things absolutely in the viewport in relation to their parent object. So it pulls it completely out of the document flow. It doesn't leave a spot for it to return to. And that's the real difference between relative and absolute. Fixed means it's going to park wherever you tell it to, based on top, right, left, bottom. And sticky is going to position it within its parent, but then it will scroll till it hits the top of the screen and stay there until the bottom of its parent scrolls off, then it leaves with its parent. So sticky adds a cool visual effect. And that is positioning. When we talk about positioning, we sometimes have to rearrange the positions of our objects so that one object isn't necessarily on top of something else. So I have these 4 paragraphs, and we can see that they were all positioned absolutely, and each one, as I work through the list of purple, orange, lime, and teal, are positioned at 10, 10, 20, 10, 30, or 10, 10, 20, 20, 30, 30, and 40, 40, so they work their way down the screen. Now, one thing that we are able to do when we position items is we can also change the order in which they show up on screen. By default, everything has a z-index or a position property of 0. So if you do not set the z-index of anything, then they are all considered 0, which means they show up in the order of your markup. But if I want to put the purple box on top, I could just as easily say I want this one to have a z-index of 1, and now it's on top, even though there's 4 objects. So the z-indexing of the objects, the stacking of them, they don't automatically all have it so that the first object is 0, the next one's 1, the next one's 2. They all have a z-index property of 0 to begin with. It's as we add in that z-index, we're able to do things differently. So if I set it to 10, we'll get the same result. But if I now take my next box and set it to 8, we'll see that now it sits behind. Both of those are on top of the lime and teal boxes, but lime and teal are later in my markup. So if we were in markup order, they should be on top. But they're not. So now if I want my lime one to sit on top of my teal one, I can give that a bigger index than the teal one. So I have now effectively flipped the order of the boxes from how it appears in the markup to how they are stacking or layering on top of each other on screen. When you start doing some positioning and you think about it where you move something, so when we have this object and now it's moved on top of this other paragraph, so now at that point, outer is on top. But if I wanted that paragraph below to be on top, I would need to set its Z property to move it on top. And I could do that if I were to write the CSS for that. So when we look at the Z sorting here, it is possible that we can use negative values if we so choose in our Z sorting, if that makes you happy. There are some situations on some designs when you're trying to do some real complex layouts and interactivity that some people do use super negative numbers to guarantee something is way behind everything else no matter what else is happening on screen. It's all good. Key thing is everything starts out at 0. If you give something a -1, it will be behind anything else on screen. If you give anything a positive number, it's going to be on top of anything that has not had a Z index assigned to it. That's really all there is to playing with Z indexing. If when you are doing your design, if your design has a mix of floating and positioned elements, so some elements are floated and some you have positioned, even though no object in this currently has any Z indexing set, and the orange paragraph comes after the purple paragraph, we can see the purple paragraph is showing up on screen on top of the orange paragraph. And that is because the orange paragraph is floating and the purple paragraph has been positioned. So when it comes to the rendering of pages, this is one of those situations where then suddenly you may have to do some Z indexing to get your parts to fit properly on your design. So you will position something, you'll float something, and suddenly your float is behind it. You're like, where'd it go? I don't see it. And then what we can do is we can just do, and okay, as long as it's floating, and it's always going to be behind it, so we will have to come up with a plan B, but that will be one of those options that you will have to address.